So I just want to highlight again some of the important takeaways that you should have from this chapter, things that I'm going to ask you to discuss, and I want to review with you the activities for this week, especially this IRB training, what my expectation is there. So chapter 2, if I take a quick look at the bookshelf here, I actually got the version of the book that looks probably very much like the version that you're using. It's not hyperlinked, which is not as much fun looking at the glossary terms, but it will then help you to see on the page where some of these things are. And I've highlighted today the things that I think are real takeaways and something I think should engage you. So remember, at the beginning of every chapter, there's the problems of practice in this chapter, and they are introducing some things like representations or concrete examples of teaching math to children. Is it better or to use symbolic representations or concrete examples? And I actually know something about this because I do a STEM course. Some of you have taken it where we talk about math, and there's a real problem. We see a real transition in students understanding math in the middle school area, and sometimes this is where developmentally students are moving from concrete to abstract. And if the abstract is, some folks in research would say if you introduce the abstract earlier, it'll be an easier transition. Some say developmentally, it's not even possible. And so somehow, some way, we need to bridge the gap developmentally to do this. And so that's an area of research that I work with because of the STEM problems, and also because as an ag teacher, when students would come into my shop and I'd say, I need you to, go measure that board. How big is it? And they would say something like 2 feet, 2 inches, and 5 little lines. That was a real problem for me. And I went back to, where's their math? Where's their understanding of fractions? What do they not know about decimals? And, this to me is a very concrete example, but they're not making the transition in a symbolic way. So anyway, that's one that I think some of you might find interest with because you experience math and math understanding for high school students, and you oftentimes have concrete examples, but they need to think more abstractly, and that's a stretch for some of them. Also in this chapter, and it's around our discussion this week, should teachers teach to the test? I know there's a lot of conversation about standardized testing, and I'm really anxious to hear what your thoughts are in the discussions about this, so I'm not going to go on anymore. But teaching to the test has become a big topic among teachers, parents, and students, and administrators, and funders. I might add state legislators, all stakeholders and policymakers in that regard, and federal government included. Do teachers, in fact, align their instruction and assessment with state curriculum standards and assessment? Remarkably, in Utah, we do a pretty good job of this. Our state dictates to districts what's going to happen in terms of curriculum, and for the most part, we just get lined up and we do that, and we align our instruction with assessments. It doesn't always happen, though. Sometimes I was actually talking with some CT teachers, and they said, "Oh, that's what the state says we're supposed to do, but we're not tested in that area, so we don't do it that way." And so that is something that gets discussed among teachers, whether or not they do or do not alignment. And then, of course, if the assessment does come, if a course is assessed and they're assessing on those particular standards and your students don't do well, there's an obvious reason why that's not taking place. And that is something that's discussed in this chapter, and we'll have a little bit of discussion around it. Do students perform better on their teachers' assessments and on statement assessments if their teachers improve their curriculum alignment? And that those two just go together. So those are some problems of practice that they are introducing in this chapter as you talk about doing your own research, because these are things that those last 2 or 3 are things that you could actually do an action research project on in your own classroom or in your own school or even in your own district. Some important ideas here: preparing the proposal. Remember, this is what this chapter is about, an overview of what a proposal looks like for a research study, increasing the if you do this, it'll increase the probability that all of the subsequent steps in the research process will be successful. So making sure that you dot your I's, cross your T's, and you've addressed all of the elements. One of the best things about this book, and I've had several courses, but they give you some nice guidelines. Oftentimes institutions will give you guidelines, departments will give you guidelines, but I've found that the ones that are identified here work both for proposals for doing thesis or research. They also work really well for doing proposals for grants and funding. So I think that they have a very, very nice outline here. A good way to start identifying research problems is to investigate the reading literature, reviews, and articles in your area of interest, and that happens with a Google search. And we'll talk about that, a Google Scholar search in particular, to look for any kind of research that's been done on something that really interests you. If it's this concrete thing on math or teaching to the test, and a whole bunch of other kinds of issues that were addressed in the previous chapter. And each week we'll have these problems of practice. They try and cover all bases, CTE kinds of things, elementary, secondary, funding, all kinds of things that hopefully you'll go, oh, yeah, that bugs me too. In fact, this week in the discussion, I ask what bugs you that you think that you would like to investigate. So those are those 4. I also have a couple on the next page that I highlighted here for you. 7, the systematic literature review will help you prepare a sound research proposal. Yeah, if it's okay to replicate a study, but say that you're doing it, and don't reinvent the wheel. If other people have attempted or addressed your question of interest, use what they've done, use it to develop your own question and say, well, this has been answered pretty well. I don't need to ask this question anymore. Or say, you know, they asked all of this and they didn't ask this. And so that's conducting the review of the literature. It's systematic. You use search terms that are consistent along the way. That helps you to form and focus in on what it is that you're really trying to answer, the question that you're trying to answer or the problem that you're trying to address. 12, you probably need to submit your research proposal to a institutional review board, IRB. You'll hear me use this throughout the semester. Some of you are already familiar with this term, which will determine whether it adequately protects the research participants from certain risks. And that's really all it's about. When you submit a proposal at this university, if you, and any university, if you're going to do any kind of research that will be published, and actually any kind of research as a graduate student, it has to go through the IRB process, the Institutional Review Board. School districts also have institutional review boards. And for example, when I did my study with CTE teachers and students, I prepared an IRB for our institutional review board. It had to have letters that I would be giving to parents, letters that kids could review about whether or not they needed to participate, letters for teachers, and really it was to protect them from certain risks, which you'll learn about as you do the IRB training. So those are required. And some school districts then, in addition to me doing an IRB here at Utah State, when I went to the districts and wanted to do the pilot study, they wanted to see the IRB, and then they had to take that IRB proposal to their district IRB folks to make sure what was going to be done in terms of research was going to protect and be confidential, protect any and all rights of the students. There was going to be no harm, no undue stress, and those kinds of things that you're going to learn about. So IRB is real. If it's a study that's taking blood and there's some other risks, which you'll learn about, those kinds of processes can take a very long time. Hospitals do IRBs. They're just a requirement of research. And when you're working with anybody under 18 years of age, that becomes even more important, as you will learn. So IRB is introduced in this chapter. You're going to all become certified to develop and go through a training then that will even allow you to submit a proposal. And that's discussed, that's begun in this week's module, and I think you have a couple weeks to get it done. I'll talk about that more in just a second. 15, a pilot study of your measures and procedures, preferably completed as part of the proposal preparation process, helps to ensure that you will not encounter unexpected difficulties when you actually conduct the study. A pilot study then probably does require an IRB, especially if it involves classrooms and students, but it really helps you to take a smaller group and decide whether or not it's going to work. And your text has probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 not that many, 5 or 6 paragraphs about a pilot study and what it means. The reason I also highlighted this is some of you are involved with the CTE College and Career Awareness course, a mandatory course for all 7th graders. It's the one that I previously did my dissertation work on. And this year they took this brand new course statewide, and they're calling it a pilot study. I think you can probably in the discussion tell me whether you do or do not think it's a pilot study when you implement something statewide. I think it's a little bit obvious. And why they use that term, I have no idea. And also in your chapter, they have, as I mentioned, the important words, vocabulary, which I think is really good. I'm really, and I ask these in the quiz, I try and get at what I think is important, but the word theory and hypothesis, I want you to know the difference between those. A couple of you had the program planning course, we talk about that. So make sure that you know the difference between a theory and a hypothesis and a construct. Those are probably the 3 big ones here. I think the other ones are pretty self-explanatory. Oh, informed consent, which you're going to learn a lot about inside of the IRB or the city training process. So that's a little bit of an overview of the chapter. I want to take a look though at figure 2.2. It's kind of a table inside the book on page 32. This is a good figure for explaining what a proposal looks like and what I call the elements of a successful proposal. And they discuss all of these things in detail in the chapter. But this is something, if you throw the book away after you're done with this course, I would rip this page out, or I would scan it and keep it somewhere electronically, because like I mentioned, it's not just helpful for doing a proposal, for doing some sort of research project. It's very useful. These elements are extremely useful for doing a proposal for any kind of grant. Some things may or may not be as important in a particular grant, but it helps you to cover all your bases. So you've got this purpose of the study. What is it you're trying? Purpose of the grant. It talks about the things that would be part of that purpose. Research questions, hypotheses, variables, and so forth. You know, things that you're going to run into, things that you're going to try. In the case of a proposal, things you're going to try and solve. The literature search. There's a whole chapter on this, by the way. But it talks about all the things that should be the literature search. It's just a nice checkbox of what you would have in a proposal and what you would look for in published research. You know, you're going to look to see did they put a hypothesis out there? Did they discuss their variables? Did they have a case delineation if it's a qualitative type of study? Did they have a very good or robust literature review? What was their research design? Was it correlational, experimental, comparison, those kinds of things? So both sides here. Did the element get included? And if you're writing something, did I write about it? So it's a way to check the boxes for things that are important. Sampling, you know, was the sample large enough? Was it too small? And when I say too small, you really don't need to say too small. If it's a case study and it adds some sort of qualitative nature, and if you could say, well, that's that situation, and I have the same demographics, I have the same socioeconomic, this probably applies in my situation. Again, there's a conversation on sampling about whether or not something is big enough or small enough and when it would be useful. Methods for data collection, that will be identified in any study that you read, and it's got to be put into a proposal, and also the analysis procedures. I think it goes on to the second page here, yes. And then ethics and human relations, which is the assignment on doing the city training this week, and then the timeline. And this is extremely important when you start doing proposals for grants. They want to know timeline for each one of the events or tasks that's going to be done, the deliverables, when you're going to be reporting and all of those kinds of things. And in case of a proposal, you're going to see a timeline of when you're going to roll out each one of the elements that are taking place in your study. And in terms of reading someone else's research, you know, this becomes a little less important, but you might see that they conducted their duration of their study. They conducted it over a year, 2 years, 6 weeks, middle of the school year, that kind of thing. So that's a really important figure in here, and very helpful, and I think you'll find it useful with other types of projects that you might do. Okay, that's a brief overview to week 2. I look forward to the discussion questions, which are posted here. I've given you some hints as to what they are. The quiz is here as well. Oh, the city training and conducting human research. This is due January 31st. Of course, early submission is always welcome. And on my screen, it says grader. That's what I have, but I think you'll have a box that says submit. Essentially, you're going to go through, it gives you the instructions on the Utah State University site about what it takes to go through this certification training and the procedures, and the way that I will check and make sure that you've gone through this training to understand the human research, understand what it takes to do human research. And essentially, unless you've done this, you are not trained, and they will not allow you to conduct any research. It doesn't take too long. It probably took me, the first time I did it, it took me a couple of hours because I read every single thing. But most students last year that I talked to said that it took about an hour, hour and 15 minutes to go through their modules that you go through. In fact, let's see if I can get in here and take a quick look. But Start the City certification is here, and then search for city certifications. That's in case some of you have gone through this process already. I know this is required in 2 courses here at USU, and if you've already done it, then you would just give me the number for completion. But it gives you the instruction for doing the city registration, create an account, so on and so forth. The instructions are all there. It's open now. You can submit early. It's not due to January 31st, so you have a couple of weeks to complete it because it does take a little extra time. I've done it in 2 sittings. I think you can complete modules and then come back if that works for you as well. So those are your assignments. That's the discussion and the quiz. links are there provided. Again, the discussion covers the questions related to Gardner's claims that you'll read about, and also what bugs you with CTE, and or if you're not a CTE teacher and you're engaged in education, you can just fill in the blank there for CTE, and that will work just as well. Look forward to reading what bugs you and also what you think about teachers teaching to the test in the discussion.